I want you to picture a massive historical contradiction. Like, just hold this in your head for a second. You have Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse, who are, arguably two of the most famous artists who have ever lived.
Right. Absolute titans of art history.
Exactly. Titans. And both of these guys looked at one specific man and called him the father of us all.
Yeah, which is a massive statement.
It really is. And you hear that and you probably picture this, I don't know, this artistic god who just strode through life, dripping with confidence, getting universal acclaim everywhere he went.
Right, completely. You'd think he was a rock star.
Right. But here is the reality. During his actual life, this man was ruthlessly mocked by critics. I mean, publicly ridiculed by his own hometown. He was rejected over and over again by official art academies.
Yeah, his professional life was brutal.
And personally, it was even worse.
Yeah.
He was so socially awkward that he literally had a phobia of being touched.
It's just a staggering disconnect, really. We revere him today as this solitary, unassailable genius. But for most of his time on Earth, he was treated as an absolute joke by the cultural establishment.
And so, that is the mission for our deep dive today. We are looking at the life and work of Paul Cezanne.
We have a massive stack of sources on the table today, too. We've got art history research, biographies, personal letters.
Yeah, curator notes from some recent museum discoveries, which are wild, by the way. And even an essay by the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty.
Right, we're going to use all of it to basically peel back the canvas, to look at the deeply human, struggling and a highly secretive man who accidentally built a bridge between 19th century Impressionism and 20th century Cubism.
It's a story of just unparalleled artistic obsession.
But it's also, it's wrapped up in a broken childhood friendship, a secret family, and this lifelong quest to completely change the mechanics of how the human eye perceives reality.
So let's start by looking at where that obsession actually comes from. Because his beginnings were highly privileged, but also, incredibly restrictive.
Yeah, very restrictive. He was born in Aix-en-Provence, down in the south of France. And his father, Louis Auguste, was a wealthy banker who co-founded a firm there.
Right, so Paul grew up with extreme financial security. We're talking an eventual inheritance of something like 400,000 francs.
Which was a fortune back then.
Yeah, massive fortune. But there was a catch, right? His strict, very authoritarian dad demanded that Paul study law so he could eventually take over the bank.
And, Cezanne genuinely tried to comply with that. He enrolled in the law faculty in his early 20s and just spent a couple of years utterly miserable.
I can imagine.
Yeah, he was neglecting his studies to, write poems in Latin and sneak off to evening drawing classes. And what really kept him sane during this period was his childhood circle.
Oh, right, the three inseparables.
Exactly. Back at school, he had formed this tight-knit trio with his two best friends. There was Baptistin Bey and a young man named Émile Zola.
Wait, Émile Zola? Like the legendary novelist Émile Zola? I had no idea they even knew each other as kids.
Oh, they were inseparable.
Yeah.
They literally called themselves the three inseparables.
Yeah.
They spent their days, swimming in the Arc River, hunting, debating art, reading Homer and Virgil.
That sounds idyllic, honestly.
It really was. And it was Zola who really pushed Cezanne to take his art seriously. Zola moves to Paris and basically hounds Cezanne to, abandon his hesitancy, drop the law degree, and just follow him to the capital.
Which Cezanne eventually does, obviously much to his father's dismay, though his father does eventually relent and gives him a living allowance.
Right, a modest one, but enough to live on.
Still, I look at Cezanne leaving a guaranteed banking fortune to go paint in Paris, and it feels, I don't know, like a modern trust fund kid dropping out of an Ivy League business school to start some weird, highly experimental garage band.
That is a remarkably accurate comparison, actually.
Right. So I have to ask, does this massive financial safety net actually make him a better artist, or does it just allow him to be a more stubborn one?
Well, the money undeniably gave him the freedom to be uncompromising. To really understand why that matters, you have to look at how the French art world worked back then.
Okay, lay it out for us.
It was a monopoly, essentially, controlled by something called the Salon. The Salon was this official state-sponsored art exhibition.
And if you weren't in it, you were nobody, right?
Exactly. If the Salon jury rejected your painting, you couldn't display it. And if you couldn't display it, you obviously couldn't sell it.
Yeah.
So most artists had to, bend to the traditional tastes of the Salon just to buy food.
Ah, okay. So the Salon was basically the gatekeeper to sheer survival.
Precisely. But Cezanne, he could endure decades of total rejection without starving. His father's money subsidized his radicalism. He didn't have to please the Salon.
Well, he certainly didn't please them, because when he gets to Paris, the art world absolutely hates what he's doing.
Oh, they despised it.
He applies to the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts and gets flat out rejected. And he's got this incredibly intense personality, and that intensity bleeds directly onto his canvases.
Right, during what art historians call his dark period.
Yeah, and dark is almost an understatement for the work he was producing in his 20s.
It's aggressively violent. If you look at a painting from this era, like The Murder, it's not some delicate landscape. It literally depicts a man bearing down on a woman with a knife.
Yeah, and the whole scene is just swallowed in these heavy, oppressive shadows.
And his technique was just as aggressive as his subjects. He wasn't delicately brushing paint onto the canvas. He was using a palette knife.
Which is a metal tool used for mixing paint, right?
Exactly. And he was using it to just slap these thick, heavy, dark tones of black, brown, and Prussian blue directly onto the surface.
It's just laying it on incredibly thick.
Yeah, he later referred to these works using a rather coarse French term, une cuillard. He was essentially boasting about their ostentatious, raw virility.
I bet the establishment loved that.
They were appalled. Edouard Manet, who, keep in mind, was an avant-garde rebel in his own right, completely dismissed Cezanne. Yeah. He famously called him a mason who paints with a trowel.
A mason with a trowel? It's such a brutal, vivid insult. You can just picture him out there slathering the canvas like it's a brick wall.
It's totally accurate, though. And that manic, heavy-handed energy was so foundational to him that he literally buried himself in it.
Wait, what do you mean buried himself?
So just recently, in 2022, a chief conservator at the Cincinnati Art Museum named Serena Uri was examining an 1865 Cezanne painting called Still Life with Bread and Eggs.
Okay.
She noticed some unusual cracking patterns in the dark paint, and on a hunch, she had the canvas x-rayed. And hidden completely underneath that still life of bread and eggs was a portrait.
Wait, really? A hidden painting, like underneath the actual artwork?
Yes, and it's likely his earliest firmly dated self-portrait, painted right in the middle of this chaotic era when he was slapping paint around with that palette knife.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he literally buried his own image under the heavy paint of a later still life.
That is incredible. But hold on, I have to push back here a little bit. You look at these dark, violent, heavy palette knife paintings, and it makes you wonder, if he's the father of modern art, why is he so famously associated with the Impressionists?
Right, people think of Monet and Renoir.
Exactly. Hanging out with those guys, painting pretty, dappled water lilies, slapping black paint onto a canvas with a metal trowel does not fit that vibe at all.
No, it doesn't. And the bridge between that violent dark period and his association with the Impressionists was a man named Camille Pissarro.
Okay, who was he?
Pissarro was a slightly older, incredibly sensitive painter who basically took this shy, angry, depressed Cezanne under his wing. Cezanne revered him so much, he actually called him God the Father.
Wow, that's high praise.
Yeah, and Pissarro taught him how to calm down, technically speaking.
How do you technically calm down a painter?
Well, Pissarro urged Cezanne to abandon the black paint entirely. He told him to lighten his palette, to use primary colors, and most importantly, he taught him how to define shapes without using harsh, thick outlines.
Because before he was basically just drawing heavy black borders around things.
Right. Instead of drawing a dark line to show where an apple ends and the table begins, Pissarro taught him to use gradations of color.
Oh, I see.
So if you put a warm patch of red right next to a cool patch of blue, the contrast creates an edge in the viewer's eye without you ever having to draw a literal line.
Okay, so he's learning to build structure entirely out of color. That makes sense. But even with Pissarro's mentorship, he was still kind of the odd man out, right? Because when he exhibits in the very first Impressionist show in 1874, it is a complete disaster for him.
A total disaster. The public and the critics were outraged by his stuff. One reviewer literally did a mock Indian dance in front of Cezanne's paintings to demonstrate how, primitive and savage he thought they were.
That is so offensive and absurd.
It gets worse. Another critic claimed the artist painted by loading a gun with color and shooting it at the canvas. Cezanne was simply too bold, too structurally weird for the mainstream.
And as his professional life is being torn apart by critics in Paris, his personal life turns into this wildly tangled web of secrets and just absolute paranoia.
Yeah, it's a mess. We mentioned at the start of the deep dive that Cezanne had a literal phobia of being touched, right?
Yeah, haphophobia, I think it's called.
Right. And by his own admission, this stemmed from a childhood trauma, where a classmate kicked him from behind on a staircase while he was sliding down the banister.
Yeah.
It left a permanent psychological scar.
So he was deeply uncomfortable with intimacy. But despite that, he meets a bookbinder's assistant named Hortense-Viquet.
Yes.
They start a relationship, and they have a son, Paul. Now, remember that strict, authoritarian banker father we talked about?
The one providing the living allowance that allows Cezanne to paint instead of practice law.
Exactly. Cezanne is absolutely terrified that if his dad finds out about Hortense and the baby, he'll cut him off. So he decides to just hide his entire family.
He essentially lives a double life, migrating back and forth between Paris and Provence.
Just imagine the sheer visceral tension of that. You are an agonizingly stressed artist trying to hide a screaming toddler in an apartment whenever your wealthy father comes to visit.
Right. Terrified that one wrong noise will plunge you into total poverty.
And of course, the secret gets out in the worst way possible. A friend of his accidentally mentions the family in a thoughtless letter. The dad finds out, and just as Cezanne feared, he cuts the allowance in half.
Which is devastating. Suddenly, that trust fund safety net is gone.
Completely gone. Cezanne is in desperate financial straits to the point where he has to beg his childhood best friend, Émile Zola, for money just to feed his family.
And he does eventually marry Hortense years later. But it's clear it's mostly just to legitimize his son's legal rights. The romantic relationship had long since broken down.
Right. But the real emotional devastation of that era isn't the loveless marriage, it's what happens with Zola.
Yes, this is heartbreaking.
So Zola is now this incredibly successful, wealthy novelist. And he publishes a book called Louvre. It's about a tragic, highly unstable painter named Claude Lantier who never achieves his artistic goals, is consumed by his own failures, and ultimately takes his own life.
Which was, as everyone knew, a very thinly veiled portrait of Cezanne.
Think about that. Just imagine your childhood best friend, the guy you swam with in the river, the guy who convinced you to move to Paris to chase your dreams, writing a massive national bestseller where the pathetic, delusional, failing side character is clearly based on you.
It's an incredible betrayal.
So Cezanne reads it, instantly recognizes himself, and sends Zola this brief, painfully formal letter thanking him for the book.
And for over a century, the accepted history was that Cezanne and Zola never spoke again after that letter. It was viewed as this dramatic final severing of their bond.
Wait, is that not true?
Well, history is always evolving. Recent discoveries of letters show that they did actually maintain some contact for a short while longer. It wasn't an instant theatrical cutoff like we thought.
Okay, but the emotional damage was still permanent, right?
Oh, absolutely. Zola clearly viewed his old friend as a failure. Zola once wrote that Paul had the genius of a great painter, but not the genius to actually become one.
Ouch.
Yeah, he claimed that the slightest obstacle drove Cezanne to despair. That betrayal of faith from his oldest friend pushed Cezanne to isolate himself completely.
So how does a man who feels entirely rejected by the Paris art world, trapped in a loveless marriage, and betrayed by his closest friend find any sense of connection?
He retreats. Physically retreats.
Right. He abandons Paris and moves back to the solitary, unmoving landscape of Provence. He works out of his family estate, and later he builds a studio on a remote hill at Les Louvres.
And he pours all of his desperate need for connection into the landscape itself.
Yeah.
But, his hometown doesn't exactly welcome him back with open arms.
Not at all. The local bourgeoisie of Aix thought he was an absolute disgrace. A critic named Henri Rochefort published a hateful article titled Love for the Ugly, claiming people had laughing fits looking at Cezanne's art.
And the locals in Aix actually bought copies of this newspaper and left them on Cezanne's doorstep.
With nasty notes telling him to leave town because he was dishonoring them.
It's just sickeningly cruel.
It really is. He literally told his coachman, I don't understand the world and the world doesn't understand me, so I withdrew from the world.
But the incredible thing is, in that isolation, he has his massive breakthrough.
Right. He stops worrying about Paris and becomes obsessed with a few key subjects right in front of him. He paints the card players. He paints the bathers. And most famously, he paints a local mountain, Mont Sainte-Victoire.
Over and over and over again. We're talking over 30 oil paintings and 45 watercolors of this one single mountain.
And the inspiration for how to capture this landscape came from something surprisingly modern, looking out the window of a moving train.
Yeah, the newly built railway line between Aix and Marseille. When you look out of a moving train window, the mechanics of your perception completely change. Well, the immediate foreground, like the trees and fences right by the tracks, blurs violently with speed. But the distant mountain, it remains fixed, solid, anchoring the entire visual field.
So the framing of the train window gave him a completely new way to understand visual permanence versus fleeting sensation.
Exactly. But his method for capturing that on canvas was agonizingly slow. He would sometimes take 100 working sessions just to paint a single still life of a bowl of apples.
100 sessions.
Or 150 sessions for a portrait.
Why? What is he doing that takes 100 sessions to paint some fruit?
To understand that, we really have to look at how he was trying to reinvent sight itself.
Which brings up his most famous quote. Cezanne writes in a letter that an artist should treat nature in terms of the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone.
Yes, the infamous quote.
Now, people hear that and they look at his blocky brushstrokes and they think, oh, he's just painting literal geometric shapes. That's why he's the father of Cubism. Is that what he was doing?
Yeah.
Just breaking nature into math.
No, and this is perhaps the single biggest historical misinterpretation of his work. Cezanne was not trying to make abstract geometric art. He wasn't trying to turn a tree into a literal cylinder just for the sake of abstract design.
So what was he doing?
What he was trying to do was replicate the physiological mechanics of human sight.
Okay, wait. How do you paint the mechanics of sight?
Let's do a quick experiment right now. If you're listening to this, focus on an object in front of you. Close your left eye. Now open it and close your right eye. Do it back and forth a few times.
Okay, so the object seems to jump side to side.
Exactly. Because you have binocular vision. Your two eyes are taking in slightly different angles of that object simultaneously, and then your brain stitches them together to understand depth and volume.
Right.
Cezanne wanted to paint that living, vibrating reality. He didn't want to paint a flat, one-eyed snapshot like a camera. He wanted to capture the volume of the apple, the heavy air pressing around it, the shifting light, all at once. So when he talks about the cylinder, sphere, and cone, he means finding the heavy, permanent structure of nature that exists beneath the fleeting sunlight the Impressionists were so obsessed with. He wanted to make Impressionism solid, like the ancient art hanging in museums.
Oh, I see. So he's painstakingly painting one edge of the apple as his left eye sees it, and another patch of color as his right eye sees it, trying to capture the whole three-dimensional experience on a two-dimensional canvas.
Yes. That's why it took 100 sessions.
So the Cubists, like Picasso and Braque, when they look at this later, did they just steal the geometry and miss the point entirely?
In many ways, yes. The Cubists largely ignored his deep, obsessive devotion to observing nature. They just took the geometric fracturing, the idea of showing multiple angles at once, and ran with it into total intellectual abstraction.
But for Cezanne, it was always about nature.
Always. Every single one of those slow, agonizing brushstrokes was an attempt to wrestle the physical truth of nature onto the canvas.
Which is a beautiful, almost tragic obsession, because that absolute devotion to capturing nature ultimately costs him his life.
It really does.
Let's look at his final years. He's struggling with diabetes, he's suffering from severe depression, and even delusions of persecution.
Right, he was very unwell.
And his paintings turn darker again. He starts painting these heavy, haunting still lifes of human skulls, like the Pyramid of Skulls. And even after decades of relentless work, he still feels like he hasn't nailed it. He writes to his son, "I cannot reach the intensity that unfolds before my senses."
It is the ultimate tragedy of a perfectionist. His vision of what art could be always exceeded his physical ability to put it in paint.
And it all culminates in October 1906. Cezanne is 67 years old. He's out in a field painting, and he gets caught in a massive freezing rainstorm.
But he refuses to stop.
He stays out there in the downpour for 2 hours before finally deciding to pack up. On the walk home, his body just gives out. He collapses on the road, loses consciousness, and has to be scooped up by a passing laundry cart driver.
He was suffering from severe hypothermia. He actually contracts pneumonia.
His housekeeper has to furiously rub his limbs just to get his circulation going, so he wakes up, and then the very next day, he goes back outside. He goes into the garden to keep working on his final painting, a portrait of his gardener. He faints again, and a few days later, he dies.
Yeah.
What drives a man to do that? A man who has been mocked his entire life, abandoned by his friends, ridiculed by his neighbors. Why work yourself to death in a freezing storm for one more brushstroke?
Because of a concept Cezanne called aller sur le motif, going to the motif.
Going to the motif?
Right. For him, painting wasn't a profession or a hobby. It was a profound psychological compulsion. He believed that painting from nature didn't mean copying an object. It meant, in his words, realizing its sensations.
So it was life itself.
Exactly. He went back out into the cold because the act of intensely looking at the world and translating it was his entire existence. To stop observing, to stop painting, would be to cease existing.
And the immediate aftermath of his death is just staggering. The very next year, 1907, Paris holds these massive retrospective exhibitions of his life's work.
And young artists like Picasso and Matisse walk into those galleries, and their minds are completely blown by what this weird, isolated man had been doing down in Provence.
The art world finally catches up to him. And if we look at his market value today, it's astronomical. One of his card player's paintings sold a few years back to the royal family of Qatar for an estimated $250 million.
It's wild. The man who couldn't get a painting into the salon, the man whose hometown literally left hate mail on his porch, created some of the most valuable objects in human history.
We mentioned at the beginning of this deep dive that we were going to look at an essay by the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty titled Cezanne's Doubt. And I think this is the perfect place to land.
Yeah, it really ties it all together.
Merleau-Ponty suggests that Cezanne's greatness wasn't born from absolute confidence. It wasn't the swagger of a genius who knew he was right and everyone else was wrong. It was born from endless, agonizing doubt.
He constantly felt like he was failing to capture reality.
Exactly. But it was that very struggle, the 100 sessions for a bowl of apples, the heavy trowel marks, the going back out into the rainstorm, that accidentally invented modern art.
He didn't set out to invent a new artistic movement at all. He just wanted to tell the absolute truth about what his eyes were physically seeing. And he was terrified every single day that he wasn't talented enough to do it.
I want you to think about that the next time you look at a piece of modern art, or really any major breakthrough in history. We tend to view masterpieces as inevitable, as if they sprung fully formed from a confident genius. But do yourself a favor today. Go look up a Cezanne painting online. Zoom in close on those thick, desperate, searching brushstrokes.
You'll see the struggle.
You really will. You aren't just looking at a mountain or a bowl of fruit. You are looking at a man wrestling with his own massive, terrifying doubt. And in those very trowel marks, you might just see the exact moment where the modern way of seeing the world began.
You'll see exactly why the father of us all was just as human and just as full of doubt as the rest of us.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.